I am so excited to dive into this study in the Gospel of John together with you. It was about 10 years ago that I became completely captivated with the book of John, and I can't quite remember the specifics of how or why it happened. I just know that when it grabbed hold, I was in deep, and I began to just pour over the book. Sometimes I would read all 21 chapters in one sitting. Other times I would break it up into chunks that I could read and savor more slowly. But I was just taken in by these vivid pictures that John painted in his Gospels. And I loved how these pictures pointed back to images that were established in the Old Testament. The deeper I was pulled into John, the more excited I became. And at one point, I became fascinated with Jesus's I am statements. And I had this idea that I should turn them into a photo book. And nothing in my life experience suggested that this was a good idea, that it was something that I should or could do. I am quite possibly the least photogenic person on earth. I take terrible pictures, and I have spectacularly awful ideas for pictures as well. But I'm not one to back down from a challenge, and so I just grabbed a hold of this. And I began to document my ideas for these pictures that would turn my photo book idea into reality. And thankfully, God is both wise and gracious, and He kept me really busy with my kids, and then I became busy with women's Bible study, and so the photo book never happened. And sometimes we only see God's leading in hindsight. And so let me tell you, His leading became very clear. A couple of months ago when I was working on my computer, I came across this file with picture ideas, and I began reading the ideas that I had had for this photo book. In some of the ideas, I thought we should burn big piles of stuff in the field in front of our house in the dark of night, because I thought this would be a good way to showcase Jesus as the light of the world. I had other ideas where the kids and I would be frolicking amongst our neighbors' sheep, maybe holding some baby lambs in our arms to show Jesus as the Good Shepherd. And another idea of mine was that Rob, my husband, would build elaborate doorway and gate systems in that same field, and that we would just go borrow some of these aforementioned sheep and try to get them to walk through these doors and gates to show Jesus as the door to the sheep field. Now, we had just moved onto our acreage months before I began having and documenting these ideas. So can you imagine how horrified our neighbors would have been if this new family in the neighborhood started lighting fires in the middle of the night and building elaborate doorway and gate systems that led to nowhere, and then stopping by to see if they could borrow some sheep? And so you can probably see that I do tend a little bit to the dramatic, but this is a far better idea, I'm thinking, for me to share my excitement about the Gospel of John with you. And so if I haven't scared you away, welcome to this Bible study in the Gospel of John. I love this book because it shows so clearly who Jesus is, why He came, and why this still matters more than 2,000 years later. About the same time that I was percolating my I am photo book ideas, some women who were sharing their belief system door to door, they stopped by my house. And I started asking questions about their faith and who they believed that Jesus was. And they quickly discovered, as I opened up my Bible and started walking them through the book of John, that this wasn't going to be a 5-minute stopover to drop off some pamphlets, because I was pretty committed to showing them in the Gospel of John who Jesus was and how their thinking that He wasn't God had them missing out on the very best part about who He was. And so they looked pretty relieved when they were finally allowed to make their escape. And I didn't think I was going to see them again. So imagine my surprise when they just kept coming by every now and again. And they would bring somebody new, someone a little bit more experienced in their faith, to try to counteract these truth claims about Jesus that we were discovering together in the Gospel of John. And so the last time that they ever came to our house, I was out front and I was weeding in the flower bed when I saw a fancy car drive up with 4 people inside. And when I saw a silver-haired man lead 3 women towards me, I knew this was getting serious. And so I called out to my oldest, who was weeding close by to me. I said, "Seamus, run inside and grab the Bible because we're going to need it." And so he brought me my Bible, and I did not have to think long or hard about where I was going to turn that day. I opened it up to the Gospel of John. And at that point, it was partly because I knew it so well, but also because it just does such a good job of showing who Jesus is. You see, Jesus claimed to be the Messiah that the Jewish people had been waiting for. But more than that, he claimed to be God. Now, there are a few people who would doubt or discount the fact that there was a historical figure, Jesus of Nazareth. There are several different belief systems that would acknowledge Jesus was a prophet. And there are many people all over the world who would say that he was a good guy, he was a good teacher, but Jesus claimed to be God. And so that's very different than being a prophet or simply a good man. And so for the next 8 weeks, we are going to investigate the truth claims that Jesus made. We're going to examine and evaluate them and then come to possible implications that these truth claims would hold as well. And it's going to be fun because one of the things that makes John's gospel an exciting read is that in trying to support Jesus's truth claims about who he is, John has structured his gospel, which simply means good news. He structured it like a courtroom trial. The first 18 verses, his prologue, they read like a set of opening arguments. Then in chapter 1, verse 19, he begins to call witnesses to the stand and he presents physical evidence. And as John brings his gospel to a close, he sums it all up with his closing arguments. He has a purpose statement that points to why he is writing his gospel. And we can find his succinct purpose and summary statement for his gospel in John chapter 20, verses 30 and 31, which read, "Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name." The point of a trial is to establish truth, to establish what happened, why it happened, and why it's significant. And so before a trial, investigators, they'll go digging for information. And when they feel like they have accumulated enough information and good information that can stand up under the burden of truth, only then are charges laid and then the trial can begin. During the trial, witnesses are called to the stand, physical evidence is presented, and motive is established. And what's interesting is both the prosecution and the defense are working with the same information. They just interpret it differently. And they have different ideas of what should happen based on this information. And so it's up to a judge or a jury to weigh the information and establish what should happen as a result, because sentencing can only happen after truth is established. So for a fair verdict to be passed, it's important to know what kind of person is on trial. Is it a good person who just made a split-second bad decision? Is it someone who, despite the bad outcome, they did have good intentions? Or is it someone whose regular pattern of behavior, whose consistent actions reveal that they have thought out and intended this course of action? And that's what we're going to be examining in relation to Jesus. Is he just a good guy who got caught up in a series of events that was beyond his scope of control? Was he someone who meant well, but he just couldn't manage the people and the situations around him? Or was his pattern of behavior, did it consistently reveal that he was on a set path, a chosen and specific trajectory that he never deviated from. We know that investigators and lawyers, they rely most heavily on the people who knew the defendant best. So people who have spent the most time with them in a variety of different situations and over a long period of time. Their testimony is going to hold more weight than someone who, say, just happened to bump into the defendant in the grocery store. And so if we're going to be using the witness of John to build a large part of our information during the trial, it's important for us to know who John is. And so John, he was just a young man when Jesus called him away from his family's successful fishing business to follow him. And so for the 3 years that Jesus ministered publicly, John was not just a part of the crowds that followed Jesus, and he wasn't just one of the 12 men who were specifically chosen to be trained by Jesus. More than that, John was part of Jesus's inner circle. So along with Peter and James, John was with Jesus at times that nobody else was. And one example of this is when Jesus took Peter, James, and John up onto a mountain, and they were able to witness him having a conversation with Moses and Elijah. These were men who had been dead for centuries. And Peter and James and John, they heard and they saw this interaction. And then more than that, they heard an audible voice of God confirming who Jesus is. They heard God say, "This is my beloved son." And so John, he had a close and an intimate friendship. He had an intimate relationship with Jesus. And in fact, in his gospel, John refers to himself as the disciple whom Jesus loved. And he doesn't say that he was the disciple whom Jesus loved best. He simply states with confidence what he knows to be true. Jesus loved him. John was an eyewitness to the trial and the execution of Jesus. And in fact, as Jesus was hanging on the cross, he specifically asked John to take care of his mother, Mary, from that day forward. And we read that's what John did. From that time on, he took Mary into his own home as his own mother. And then after Jesus's bodily resurrection and his ascension into heaven, John became one of the early leaders in the church. He devoted the rest of his life to declaring the good news that Jesus was who he said that he was. And we don't know all the details of John's life for the next 50 to 70, maybe more years that he was alive after Jesus ascended into heaven. But we do know that somewhere between 80 and 90 AD, John sat down to record this good news that he had devoted the rest of his life to. And by the time John is sitting down to write, all the other books that make up our New Testament, they had all already been written. By this time, the Apostle Paul, Peter, the disciple, and the rest of the disciples, along with James and Jude, Jesus' half-brothers, all of them had already been killed for their witness as to who Jesus was. Only John remained as the last eyewitness. And so much had changed since his early days of walking with Jesus. John had already left Jerusalem before Rome came in and conquered the city of Jerusalem and destroyed the temple in 70 AD. John was gone before that, and he was living in Ephesus, an important urban center in the Roman Empire. Very likely, this is where John was living when he wrote his good news. The young church at this point, it already had faced fierce persecution for standing firm on Jesus's claims about who he was. And as an old man, John had already watched lies come and go and be replaced by new lies, and he had seen the truth remain. John, he had lived long enough after Jesus's resurrection and ascension to know that the truth about Jesus's claim to be God, that was the truth. It was the hinge that history was going to turn on. He knew that it was the truth that changed everything. And so that was the truth that was going to be most vehemently attacked. And so John, he sits down to write with a specific purpose. These things are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. And John knows this good news, it comes with a promise of life. This is life or death stuff. It's serious. And when we are evaluating serious decisions, we want to make sure that we have the right information so that we can make a good decision. And as a middle-aged woman and mother to 4 children, I'm embarrassed to admit this is why I still hate going to the doctor for myself or for the kids, because I know physical health, it's a serious issue. And it's important that I both have and share good information so that I can help the people who are trying to help me or my children. But I know enough to know that I don't know nearly enough. And so I get anxious that I'm going to share the wrong information or not enough of the right information. My older sister and my younger brother, both of them are nurses, and in their collective wisdom and experience, they have diagnosed me as having white coat syndrome. And all white coat syndrome is an increase in blood pressure that comes with the fear or anxiety in medical situations. And surprisingly, my blood pressure, it stays pretty stable when I'm at the doctor, but it's my ability to think and behave rationally that doesn't. And so I would like to argue against their diagnosis, but the weight of evidence, it testifies in their favor, not mine. So I get nervous when doctors and nurses, they inevitably ask this barrage of questions. I feel like this is a test that I'm destined to fail. They'll say to me, describe your pain. Is it burning or is it stabbing? And I have experienced neither. And so I don't know how to talk intelligently about either sensation. But when I hear them talk about burning and stabbing, I think, well, my pain feels like a burning, stabbing pain. And they likely roll their eyes and then try to set a scale about how intense is my pain. So they say, rate your pain for us on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being the worst pain you've ever experienced in your life. But I can't just give them a number, because what if the worst pain that I've ever experienced in my life, so my 10, that's somebody else's 5. And so what if, because I'm giving them the wrong information, they totally overdose me on pain medication? And so I can't just say, oh, like I'm at a 6. I have to let them know how I've set the scale. I have to inform them about every single detail or experience that I am using to create my scale. And because I know that I don't know very much, I start with information that I'm pretty sure is relevant. And then I start sharing information that I'm not sure about. And by the end of it, I am telling them every detail and every experience that I can think of, just in the off chance that a detail crucial to my treatment is buried somewhere in everything that I'm sharing with them. And I have discovered that nurses and doctors, they neither need nor want my life story. And unfortunately, I can say from experience that when doctors and nurses ask to see one part of your body, they're not interested in looking at other unrelated body parts. So my advice to you is, if they don't ask, don't show. But thankfully, John, he doesn't do in his gospel what I do when I'm at the doctor. He doesn't throw every possible thing out there at his readers in the hope that they're going to be able to sort through all the information and come to a good decision. He doesn't trust that they can tell the difference between the good and the bad and know what to toss and what to keep. John has firsthand knowledge of the experiences and the people and the events. And so he writes with a specific purpose that he knows how to achieve. In the last sentence in his gospel, John says that he hasn't written about every single thing that Jesus ever said or did. He says, there are also many other things that Jesus did. Were every one of them to be written, I suppose that the world itself couldn't contain all the books that would be written. John writes concisely about all that he heard and saw and learned from Jesus. And he gives us, the readers, the information that we need to be able to make the decision to believe. And you might think that that sounds amazing, but how do we know that we can trust John? How do we know that he isn't purposely just feeding us the good stuff that is going to lead us to believe and then holding back the stuff that would stop us from believing? This is where we have to weigh the evidence. And the evidence of history, it tells us that John, he never returned to his family's successful fishing business. He spent the rest of his life into old age committed to sharing about the good news that Jesus is who he said that he was. At the beginning of Revelation, which was also recorded by John, we see that as an old man, as an old man, John was imprisoned for his commitment to his belief that Jesus is who he said he was. People who are unsure, who lack conviction, they're just kind of in it for a good time, they don't have that kind of staying power. They're out of there when things get tough. They give up. And John, he stands alongside the Apostle Paul, Peter, and the rest of the disciples, early church leaders who gave their lives, often in horrific ways, because they were committed to the truth of who Jesus was. They were committed to sharing the good news that God had come in the person of Jesus Christ. And so John, he lived and he died in full assurance of his faith that Jesus was who he said that he was. And so as we move through the gospel and as we follow the trial, we will see that believing Jesus's truth claims, they were never intended to be a blind leap of faith. We'll see how Jesus provided consistent evidence to back up who he was. And when his listeners didn't understand the evidence and the teaching that he was providing for them, he explained it for them. He backed up what he said by how he lived and what he did. Jesus never led his followers down random paths or obscure trails. He always had that destination laid out early, and he provided plenty of signs along the way. Often the wonders that Jesus did, they're referred to as miracles. But John intentionally, instead of using the word miracles, he uses the word signs. And he does this because signs aren't the point. They're not the destination. They point to or they lead to it, but they are not that in and of itself. Many years ago, my sister and her husband, they were traveling through Germany by car. And they didn't have a set schedule. They just kind of took each day as it unfolded. And so one day, as it wound down and they were tired and needed somewhere to stay, they wanted to stay somewhere that wasn't a big touristy destination, but somewhere that was big enough to have decent accommodation. And they had been driving for a while already, and they had noticed a lot of signs had the word Osfort on it. And they hadn't seen this town in their guidebooks. And so they thought, you know what? There's a lot of signs for this place, and yet we haven't read about it in our guidebook. So this looks like a good place to stay. And so they drove, and they went by small towns, and they went through larger towns, and they kept driving as they were waiting to come to Osfort. But it never came. And the more they drove, the more frustrated they became because they were passing by lovely places as they were holding out for Osfort. It turns out that they were giving that sign more significance than they should have, because it turns out Osfort just means exit. It was a sign pointing to destinations, but it wasn't a destination in and of itself. And so they were doing a lot of exiting, but not a lot of arriving because they weren't reading or understanding the signs correctly. And John, he wants his readers to see that the point of every miracle that Jesus did, it wasn't the miracle itself, They were all signs that were pointing to something, to someone far larger, far more important. And so let's take our seats on the jury. Let's start this trial and see, what is it that John is pointing us to? And we're going to start with his opening arguments today, the first 18 verses of John chapter 1. John 1:1, it starts out by saying, in the beginning. Unlike the other Gospels, which start either with Jesus's birth narrative or at the beginning of his public ministry, John is pointing his readers all the way back to the beginning of everything. He is intentionally opening his Gospel with the same three words that open Jewish scripture. Genesis 1:1 says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. In the beginning, there was nothing but God who created everything from nothing. John is taking aim at his Jewish readers, but he is also pointing something out to his non-Jewish readers. He's saying at the beginning, there was nothing but God. And then there was everything. Everything that exists came from this God who created everything out of nothing. And if this is true, then everything is from God and everything is for God. And we hear Paul echo this in 1 Corinthians 8:6 when he writes, there is one God, the Father, from whom are all things and for whom we exist. Does that hit you between the eyes like it does me? Because I hear those words through the filter of my culture, which is an independent, individualistic worldview. My culture tells me that I've got to make it on my own. I have the right to do things my way. I call the shots. I'm the master of my destiny. And if I make it on my own, I'm the one who gets all the credit for having made it. And when things are going really well, that sounds awesome for me. But then when I hear that I exist for God and not myself, it doesn't sound so awesome anymore. And I bristle a little bit at this line of thinking. But what if things aren't going that well? Is it because I'm a failure? Do I have to carry the weight of that failure all by myself? Or is everything just random chance? If everything is from God and everything is for God, then there's no such thing as random chance. It means that everything exists for a plan and for a purpose. It means that the God of the universe, which is the only God that could exist if this beginning is true, it means that he planned your life and your purpose for a very specific reason. He wanted you. You are the creative, one-of-a-kind work of God. And so this is true no matter who you are. Whether people came together because they wanted to have you, or whether people came together and you were just merely the result, but never the plan. It doesn't matter. There is a plan and there is a purpose for your life. You're here because God willed you to be here. And so let's keep going with John's opening arguments. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and that life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. So at this point, we don't know the identity of the one that John refers to as the Word. We know that the Word was in the beginning with God. We know the Word was God. We know that the Word spoke everything that exists into existence, and that he is the source of life and light, which banished the darkness. And we know that with those first three words in the beginning, that John was pointing us to Genesis 1:1. But with these next verses, we see that he's also pointing us past Genesis 1:1 to the next verses in Genesis, which read, the earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters, and God said, let there be light, and there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. Before creation, there was chaos and darkness. And then God spoke, and there was life and light and order. Most cultures, they have creation accounts to explain how life came about, to answer the question, why is there something instead of nothing? They're an attempt to explain the purpose for our existence and to defy the potential hopelessness that we're all just here by random chance. John is clear that our purpose and our meaning, it is rooted in creation and in the God who spoke all things into creation. And so now we're going to keep going with the arguments, and we're going to see that John refers to the first witness. So in verse 6, it says, there was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to bear witness about the light, that all might believe through him. He was not the light, but he came to bear witness about the light. So John, this isn't the John writing the gospel, it's John the Baptist. He was sent by God to do a job. And his job was to point all people, not to himself, but through him to the light. The true light, which gives light to everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. But to all who did receive him, to all who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. And so we read in John's opening arguments that no matter the specifics of your physical family, you have been invited into God's spiritual family. And this family only has first generation members. Spiritual DNA doesn't get diluted as it moves down the gene pool. Big noses run in my family, and our hope is that as family members marry and bring new genetic material into the gene pool, it's going to dilute the gene that is responsible for the big noses, and so that eventually coming generations will look a little bit less nasally than the ones who went before them. But in God's family, the gene pool, it doesn't get diluted. Every single child of God bears his image. All of us imperfectly, but all of us equally. And so no matter who you are, you have a vested interest in this child, because the good news that John is writing about, it's for you personally and specifically. And with the word but, so he came to his own people, they didn't recognize him, but to all who did. With that word, we notice this interesting turn that we're going to see over and over again in John's gospel. The truth claims of Jesus, that's what's on trial. But John, he often turns the tables on the people who are following this trial. And he says, if Jesus is who he claims to be, what are you going to do about it? Because he came to give everyone the opportunity to become part of the spiritual family. And John, he contrasts the physical and the spiritual, physical family with the spiritual family that God is creating. And we're going to see that Jesus performs physical miracles to address physical needs, but he's always pointing with these miracles towards deeper spiritual realities. And if this wasn't the case, then Jesus would have had to stay on earth and just keep doing these miracles over and over and over again, because we always would need them. Physical needs, they point to deeper spiritual needs. And for that reason, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory. Glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. The Word took on flesh and lived among us. John, he's using these opening arguments to tie together creation with the incarnation. And incarnation, it just refers to the coming together of the divine and the human. So Jesus, retaining all the fullness of being God, while also taking on human flesh. And John, he's tying together creation with the incarnation to put them on the same level. Creation, it dealt in physical realities. The incarnation dealt in the spiritual. John's gospel, it is a spiritual gospel for physical people. And the Word took on flesh and became a physical person to point us to God. Because when God dwells with mankind, it is always good news. And we can catch a glimpse of this in Revelation 21, where we see this picture of what it's going to be like when God fully and finally and completely dwells with man. And there is going to be no more mourning or crying or pain or death. And when we look at Jesus' ministry while he was on earth, that's what characterized it. Lame men walked, blind men saw, the sick were healed, the dead were raised to life. God dwelling with mankind is the best news. And so at this point in verse 15, John, he inserts a little bit more witness testimony when he says, John, again, John the Baptist, bore witness about Jesus and cried out, "This is he of whom I said, he who comes after me ranks before me because he was before me." John the Baptist, he's saying the physical reality is that Jesus of Nazareth is my younger cousin. But the deeper spiritual reality is that he's always existed. He was here long before me because he's God. Verse 16 says, "For from his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. For the law was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ." Did you catch that? For the first time in these opening arguments, we see who the Word is, who was at the beginning with God and was God, who made all things, who has life and light inside himself and overcame the darkness, who came into the world that he created to invite all who would believe in him into his family. It's Jesus Christ. And Moses, he had transmitted God's law to God's people, and it was a good thing. That was the first grace because it showed how God could dwell with man. It showed mankind who God was. But the law, it came through Moses, but not from Moses. It didn't reflect who Moses was. It was pointing to something more, to someone different. It was pointing to Jesus. And when Jesus came, he extended grace from his own fullness. He was the one that the law had been pointing to all along. He was the one who would fill it up. God had come in the flesh to dwell among his people. Why? Verse 18 says, "No one has ever seen God, the only God, who is at the Father's side. He has made him known." Jesus came to make God known. People can't see God face to face, but Jesus has been in intimate relationship with God since before time even existed. He's been at God's side. He is himself God, and so he is going to show us in great detail who God is and what he is like. As the image of the invisible God, Jesus is the ultimate witness. He is the only way that we are going to get eyewitness testimony about who God is. So Jesus claimed to be God, and this is a radical claim. It doesn't allow us to evaluate the details of this case and say, yeah, no, he was a good person, maybe a prophet. It doesn't allow us to examine the evidence and conclude that he certainly did good things, but just leave it at that. Because Jesus said he was God. And so if he wasn't, he was a liar. He was manipulative because he claimed to be God just to attract a following. But if he is God, if we evaluate the evidence and we conclude that the evidence backs up what he says, that's got to have some serious implications. On our life journeys, there are some exits that we want to take and some that we want to let pass us by. But what if for the next 8 weeks, you got off on this exit of investigating who Jesus is? What if for this set period of time, you decided to examine the evidence and then come to a verdict? Is Jesus who he claimed to be? John's gospel, it's been called a pool that's shallow enough for a child to wade in, but deep enough for an elephant to swim in. And so I don't know if you're more like the child who's coming in and just starting to get your feet wet, or if you're more like the elephant and this is a pool that you've been hanging around or in for a long time. But either way, it doesn't matter. Just jump in and get wet. Come and see who Jesus is. Come and see for yourself if Jesus isn't worth turning your whole life on its head for. In his prologue, John, he writes that the darkness, it couldn't overcome the light. There's a saying that all of history is written by the victor, and the ultimate victory in all of history, it has already been accomplished and written by the victor. The course of time is set, but the author of life is still writing. He's writing on individual hearts and lives. And so can you imagine what it would look like if Jesus is who he claims to be, to just let him loose, let him write his story all over your life? Based on my own experience, I would say that it'll probably be messy, but exciting. There will be times it will be really confusing, but it will still be exhilarating. And I don't doubt that it's going to be hard and painful, but it will have joy. And even when there is tears, you will not be without hope, because life in Christ, it comes with the sure hope that it is going to end spectacularly. Actually, it comes with the sure hope that it isn't going to end. It will result in eternal life in the presence of God. So come and see Jesus. Heavenly Father, you created mankind to bear your image and to long for your presence. Throughout time, you have come in many times in many ways, but in the event that defined all time, you came to us in the person of your Son, Jesus Christ, the Word who took on flesh. You have said that just like the rain and the snow, they come down from heaven and they don't just return, they're empty, but they water the earth and they make it bring forth and sprout so that there's seed for the sower and bread for the eater. And in the same way, that's what your word is like. It's going to go out from your mouth and it won't return to you empty. It's going to accomplish that for which you purpose, and it's going to succeed in the thing that you have sent it for. And so come and open our eyes to see you. Accomplish in our lives what you have purposed for them. We pray this in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen.